There's a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't have a name. It isn't failure. It isn't unhappiness. It isn't burnout in the way people usually describe it. It's the feeling of looking at your life, the career, the reputation, the stability you built, and realizing that all of it is intact, but none of it is moving. You're not struggling. That's almost what makes it harder to talk about. By most traditional metrics, you've succeeded. You have the titles, the experience, and the responsibilities that younger versions of yourself once aspired to. But lately, there is a quiet, persistent friction. You are highly competent, and yet that competence no longer feels like it's propelling you forward. It feels like it's holding you in place. The goals that used to drive you, the next promotion, the next milestone, the next marker of external validation, have lost their pull. You're not lost. That you're simply no longer motivated by the rules of a game you've already mastered. The erosion of invisible momentum. Most people describe this phase as burnout or a midlife crisis, but those terms are imprecise. They imply a breakdown. What's actually happening is an identity misalignment. You have accumulated a vast reservoir of expertise, but you are still operating within a system designed to reward raw effort and upward climbing. In the first half of life, the world asks you to prove what you can do. In the second half, it needs to know who you are and what you represent. When you continue trying to win using the old metrics, more hours, more output, more tactical activity, you feel diminishing returns, not because your capacity has declined, but because the metrics themselves no longer fit the phase you're in. You watch younger peers accelerate with an energy you remember having, and for the first time, that your history feels less like an asset and more like weight. You start to wonder, if I change now, do I have to dismantle everything I've built to do it? The answer is no. But the strategy has to change. The structural shift of progress. There's a structural reason why midlife feels like a plateau. In your 20s and 30s, progress is additive. You add skills, credentials, connections, achievements. It's a season of acquisition. More is the direction. But as you move into your 40s and 50s, the rules of progress quietly change. Reinvention in midlife is not additive, it's subtractive. It's about stripping away the roles, the obligations, and the self-perceptions that no longer reflect your real leverage. It's about moving from high performer to authority. A high performer is judged by their output. An authority is judged by their judgment. If something feels stalled, but it's likely because the competition is still happening on output, in a phase where the greatest value is pattern recognition. The energy is going toward earning a seat at a table where the more accurate move is setting the agenda. This isn't a criticism of the past. The first half required exactly that kind of effort. It's simply that the same approach applied to a different phase produces a different result. You're the reset fallacy. The primary fear that keeps capable people from moving is what might be called the reset fallacy. The cultural narrative around reinvention says, start fresh, follow a new passion, become someone new. And at 45 or 55, that narrative feels dangerous. There's a reputation to protect, financial obligations, a family that relies on stability. The idea of starting over feels like an insult to the decades of work already invested. It feels like invalidating the past. This is why most midlife reinventions fail, because they attempt to ignore the existing infrastructure. True reinvention at this stage isn't about becoming someone else. It's about repositioning the person you already are, moving from being the person who does the work to the person who owns the perspective. When viewed that way, the history isn't the obstacle, it's the material. Your age isn't a liability, it's your primary strategic advantage. The conversion of capability into influence. Confidence in midlife doesn't disappear. It often just becomes misallocated. The feeling of less confidence, compared to 10 or 15 years ago, usually comes from measuring against a version of growth that no longer fits the life stage. The first half of life is about building capability. The second half is about converting that capability into influence. Influence doesn't require the same energy as achievement. It requires presence, clarity, us, and the willingness to stop doing the things that others can do just as well. The friction you feel is the friction of outgrowing your current container. You are being asked to trade the how for the why, the doing for the directing, and that transition is uncomfortable in a specific way, because it requires being a beginner again in one area, operating without the familiar structure of titles, metrics, and external validation telling you that you're on track. That disorientation is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that the transition is real. The reality of constraints. None of this is simple to execute. That's worth saying directly. You have obligations that weren't part of the earlier picture. Financial responsibilities, family commitments, a reputation that took years to build. The appetite for risk is different now. That's not weakness, it's rationality. There's also a particular fatigue that tends to accumulate at this stage. Not physical necessarily, but the tiredness that comes from carrying the expectations of others for a long time, from performing competence in a role that may have quietly stopped fitting, and underneath all of it, a concern that rarely gets named openly, that moving in a new direction might look unstable, that the people who've known you in one role won't understand a different one. These are legitimate considerations. Dismissing them doesn't help. What helps is understanding that the reinvention being described here doesn't announce itself as disruption. It presents as evolution. And evolution, when it's grounded and deliberate, doesn't undermine credibility. It deepens it. The goal isn't to escape your life. It's to re-architect it so it feels like it belongs to you again. The hidden identity reconstruction here is the realization that tends to arrive quietly, usually after sitting with everything that's come before. That your first half of life was not the main event. It was the gathering of raw material, the skills developed, the failures endured, the reputation built. These are the bricks. For decades, the focus was on the quality of the bricks. Now comes the part where you decide what kind of structure to build with them. Reinvention isn't about changing your history. It's about changing your relationship to it. The shift is from accumulated competence to directed authority. When that shift happens, then the anxiety about wasted time begins to dissolve. Because you realize you couldn't have done this at 25. You didn't have the data. You didn't have the pattern recognition. You didn't have the authority that only comes from sustained exposure to complexity. The plateau isn't a dead end. It's a vantage point. From here you can see what younger people can't yet see. The long arc of consequences, where the real leverage is hidden, which problems are actually worth solving. That's not nostalgia. That's a structural advantage. The quiet authority. The rules of progress have changed, and they've changed in a direction that favors depth over pace, discernment over volume, credibility over visibility. The world has no shortage of high-energy achievers. What it's short on is people with grounded judgment and the composure that only comes from experience. Reinvention at this stage doesn't require a loud announcement. It doesn't require a fresh start or a dramatic pivot. It requires a quiet decision to stop competing in the dimension where you're least advantaged, and to start operating from the one where your advantage is most concentrated. You are not starting over. You are finally beginning to deploy the leverage you've spent your whole life building. Confidence doesn't come from knowing you can do everything. It comes from knowing precisely what you no longer need to do. That clarity, earned, not assumed, is the midlife advantage. And it's already yours.